Okay, good morning, everyone. So I thought I would start off before we discussing service needs. I do think that just a refresher on looking at authorizations is helpful. We frequently get questions from partners about, okay, we discussed this, but this is written in the comment section or this is written somewhere. And so to have a really good conversation about what's really important to focus on the authorization, and what are some of the things we can change or not change on our side after we've already encumbered the funds? Just talk through some of those common questions that we get. So I'm going to share my screen today, and it's going to go much better than it did yesterday at the forum. Okay, is everyone seeing my sample? Perfect. So I have pulled up a performance-based agreement sample authorization that has been created for training. And some important things: the issue date is the date that it was actually issued and the money was encumbered. Sometimes you will have a service date that starts later, and that's the actual date that you and a counselor maybe discussed of it starting. What we sometimes find is, the service had actually started on June 30th. This is silly because, of course, we know it's crossing a fiscal year, but this is just a fake one. Oops, we actually met on, June 30th instead of 7/1. But if the issue date is before you start services, then you still have funding encumbered and you're still in, everything is still in compliance with our purchasing policies for the state. So the issue date is kind of an important backup date to your service dates. In general, the service dates will show you the range of time that it's expected you will be providing services under this authorization, but the issue date is a nice backup date to understand when the funds were actually encumbered. Of course, you have your authorization number here. If this is reprinted after an overnight of the business day, we sometimes get the purchase order back from our statewide purchasing system, SWIFT. So occasionally you will get a copy of an authorization that also has a purchase order number listed after the dash. The name of the person, their record ID in our Workforce One system. Typically your company's name and address is under the service vendor. That address is not as essential as your remit to vendor. Sometimes we have partners move and they forgot to change their address in SWIFT, or their invoice still has their old address, that sort of thing. Your current address in the statewide purchasing system, SWIFT, has to match your remit to vendor. If you change your address in between, getting an authorization and then invoicing, just make sure your invoice matches your new address so that there's no delay in payment. So the remit to address is somewhat important to keep an eye on. This is your SWIFT ID number for that state purchasing system. And then here's where we kind of get down to what's important to focus on and what is something that you can disregard if it's causing any sort of conflict. It's important to look at the number of units. On your contract, we know that milestones are listed as 1 each. Sometimes we will have things listed as hourly, but there have also in the past been like courses or other things that should be billed as an each. So you should always see this listed as each if it matches something on your contract reading each, or it should say hour if it's an hourly service. Here we have the description. These autofill now in our Workforce One, but this is where staff typically can enter their own description. So this is where we sometimes have a discrepancy. For example, under employee development services, the staff might write something like personal adjustment training or, whatever. And then here it will say the employee development services under service type and title. The description has no actual bearing on your payment and your invoicing. So to some extent, you can disregard this. It's a place for staff to kind of reiterate what is going to be agreed upon, or it's a place maybe to add a little bit of helpful information. But literally this could say something random like Ann Paulson likes pumpkin spice, and it wouldn't matter at all. What does matter is that in our state payment system, SWIFT, the service type and title should be accurate to match what is on your contract and what you are going to be invoicing us for. This is what actually matches up to the funding. I don't know if people can see my cursor, Sarah.
I can see your cursor.
Okay, excellent, because I am kind of using it to point, and then I thought, oh, maybe I should be using descriptions of columns. So yeah, it's the third column in service type and title. That term there should match what's on your contract, in this case, PBAs. And for PBAs, we also now helpfully really spell out it's an E1 PBA, it's the first milestone signed placement plan meeting. Unit price should always be accurate to match your contract. And then the total price, if this were an hourly service and you had more than one, the total price would be that total. Sometimes, well, I'll go over an hourly one soon and we can discuss that. But service type and title, unit price, and the number of units is the most important information for you to have. Again, down here in the comment section, that can be a place where staff add helpful information. Perhaps they might, for pre-ats, give you a breakdown of how many hours are for travel, you know, that sort of thing. But again, not having any real bearing on your work. So if there is ever a discrepancy between description and service type and title, what matters to be correct is the service type and title. If the description isn't quite what you thought it should be, it's worth a conversation, but you don't have to worry about getting a new authorization as long as the service type and title is accurate. I'm now going to pull up another authorization form. Is everyone seeing one for job coaching? Perfect. Again, authorization number, issue date, that range of date services that is anticipated. My remit to address is going to match what I invoice for and what I have in SWIFT. And here, again, we see an example of an hourly service. 35 hours. Again, someone helpfully wrote a job description or a description that, yeah, there's some job coaching that during this time. One moment. Thank you. My dogs thought they should participate. Service type and title. It's that on the job supports, time limited, job coaching. And this contract had me listed at $80 an hour, and this is my total price. Sometimes we get authorizations that are issued for the wrong unit price. Perhaps it's a time that contracts have just been updated and staff put in $80, but now it's $100. Staff cannot change the unit price. However, they could change this to read $3,500. If your total price is going to be enough money to invoice for all of your units, then that's what we change so that we don't risk being in violation of having funds encumbered prior to the start of service. So again, sometimes a VR tech or staff will say to you, I can't change it to read $100 an hour, but I can change the total. I can add more funds to that line in SWIFT so that there will be $3,500 available to pay for those job coaching hours. That is perfectly legitimate, and that should be accepted by our partners. Because again, we've gone into SWIFT, the unit price is locked, unfortunately, with whatever the staff put in, but we as, or the techs and staff as state buyers, whoever has the authority to do that can then add more funding to the line. So you'll sometimes find a new authorization that has just a different total price amount that doesn't quite match the math. This is also an example of how you should have travel listed as a separate line under general services. And then you should also have
I think Janine froze on us. I think her whole computer went. Sarah, do you have the authorizations that Janine was going through? I don't either. We were not prepared for Janine to.
Oh, her Zoom uninstalled in mid-meeting. Poor lady. Well, we can give her a moment and we can also wing it.
And we did have a question that came through the MS form that I think we can answer while Janine is getting back here. So the question is it okay for us as CRPs to ask for the PDF version of an authorization when we are sent a different screen view? We are often sent a document with the title Authorizations with Payments from Workforce One. So I don't know if somebody wants to jump in, otherwise I can jump on into. So I think and the question came in anonymously. So if we're not answering it quite correctly, jump on and give us more information. But it sounds like you're just getting like a Workforce One view of the authorization, which maybe is a little bit more difficult to read. So yes, you can always ask for a PDF version of that authorization. It is not difficult at all for field staff to get that into a PDF version. And I see Janine is back, so we'll let her continue, but we thought we'd do a question that came in off the MS form while you were away.
I am so sorry about that. The state minute doesn't like Zoom on our computers sometimes, and it decided to uninstall the program quickly before I could click anything to get it to stop doing that right in the middle of my presentation. Unfortunately, I'm joining from the browser now, and I can no longer share my screen, but I think we've kind of covered the basics on that. I was going to show a pre-ETS example as well, but I know from our forum yesterday, you do have some great examples of those authorizations. Again, you always want to look at the column about service types and titles, and then you really want to pay attention to how many units or hours have you been authorized for, the unit price, and then for sure the total price. Is there enough total money there for you to invoice everything that you are planning to invoice for? If you ever do run into an issue, you know, the earlier you can kind of screen your authorizations and make sure they're going to match what you need before you start services is ideal. But again, sometimes we have, you know, partners saying, yeah, but I need a fresh new authorization. I'm doing my billing now and this one doesn't work. That's not going to be possible, you know, to go back at that point. So we do want to make sure that you're screening them as they come in. You're kind of, like I said, again, the description, the comments, if those aren't quite right, it's worth a conversation with the referring counselor to say, hey, are we still on the same page about what I'm going to be providing? But the service type and title is the most important thing for you to focus on, because that, again, is kind of what actually is going to match what you are invoicing, and then will match what is encumbered in SWIFT, our statewide payment system, for you to get paid. And here again, we've got it broke down with the wages. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your screen. The description is helpful. It's great information, but if somebody didn't write that, it's still a valid authorization as long as you're aware, yes, I'm paying them $11 an hour and the math works out. That $16.50, that wages plus 50% is going to match what I need for invoicing later. Thank you, Sarah. So that's how you actually read an authorization. And like I said, you know, sometimes it can stop some of that back and forth if you're like, oh, well, the description is kind of random, but I know that the service type and title is correct. And I'm clear that I've got enough hours and I've got enough money encumbered. We're good to go. Moving on to requesting those service hours. Again, sometimes we have pain points or conversations about what a counselor puts on the employment plan versus what's the contracted service type and title, you know, and some questions and confusion about that. When you are requesting or talking about services with a counselor, it's always helpful to reference your attachment D from your professional technical contract. That has your actual service types and titles that your agency can provide services to Voc Rehab for. So a counselor might say, you know, Jess's Up North team agency that she created, Jess, sorry, I just put you on the spot. Her Up North team, can you just provide some work adjustment training? You know, maybe they've been around a long time, they're familiar with that term. And Jess is like, yeah, that's fine, we can do that. But she doesn't have employee development services, which is the new service type and title that would encompass that. on her contract, then we would have a problem, right? We can't possibly authorize or pay Jess for her work. And we don't want to get into a situation where she has started work and there's not a good way to authorize for it. So again, kind of referencing your attachment D, cost detail with your contracted services. Whatever the current approved, fully executed copy of that is what is appropriate and legal and reasonable at that time for us to authorize to you for. You might have an amendment in the works that is going to increase rates, but at the date of issuing the authorization, we have to go off your current contract. So referencing that in your conversations, being, saying, hey, it sounds like we're talking about, pre-ETS job exploration counseling based on the definition. Yes, I have that on my contract. How many hours are we thinking? Is it, am I going to also need travel or transportation? That's an important part of having service discussions. In VR, there is a little bit of inconsistency. Some teams have kind of the messaging that they shouldn't be offering up extra services like travel and transportation. Other teams are like, please ask, because we don't want to be told later that our partners would have liked having travel or transportation to provide that service. So I would recommend to all of our partners that you also take on the responsibility of having that conversation and saying, yes, I'm going to provide job coaching to Sarah at her job. Can we discuss travel time for me to get back and forth from her site? And then also, what is her transportation plan? Will I be expected to transport her? And again, make sure that's on your cost detail on your PT contract. The last thing I'm going to talk about, and Sarah had put into the chat too, that resource, you can find a lot of our invoicing and billing, sample authorizations, and also sample reports on our community partners website. And that's a really helpful place always to go to and check in. In addition to the service definitions, there's also a section on invoice and billing. And if you can't find a resource there, reach out to your contract liaison. We can either point you to how to get to the resource, or it might be something that isn't posted, and that's really good feedback for us to say, okay, this might be helpful for more than this one situation, and we should talk about getting it posted to our website. So please do reach out if you don't find what you need after checking out that section. Kind of the last part of our conversation is, what are some things that can prevent authorizations from being issued? Sometimes a service need comes up and it's not on the current employment plan. What you never want to do is spring on a referring VR counselor, last minute, like, oh, by the way, this person also needs clothes, or, oh, by the way, I'm also going to be traveling today, but it's not on my authorization. As much as possible, have those discussions, a few days to a week plus ahead of time, because the counselor will have to add the service type and title to the employment plan, do their background policy research on, is this a reasonable service to provide for this individual? And then they'll need to get a signature in some fashion from the individual or their guardian. So anything that has to be added to the employment plan, it's not currently on it, but it's a service that now the individual is going to need in their work to get a job. It's really important that you kind of try to give some time where you can. We realize things come up last minute. That's the nature of the work. But in general, early communication and frequent communication prevents some of those situations. Another really good thing that Kim Babine brought up yesterday is the Minnesota Department of Human Rights forms. They don't prevent authorizations from being issued, but they do prevent payments from being processed. So your directors, your agency heads that are in charge of that, it'll be important for them to stay on top of some of those paperwork things, being timely and getting back signed amendments or contracting documents, all that sort of thing. Keep services really moving, freely forward. So employment plan is a big thing that stops authorizations, and then definitely those Minnesota Department of Human Rights forms don't stop the authorization, but they create a bit of a ruffle in VR, because we then become concerned about, okay, we authorized for services, but are we going to be able to pay them when they bill us for this? And I am drawing a blank at this moment. Can any of my other program specialists think of other things that might prevent an authorization from happening? Okay. So it looks like we have a lot of questions. I'm kind of done with the formal chatting. So whoever is moderating Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions about authorizations, or anyone can answer. Thank you.